let's focus on the first learning objective from Unit 3. Selecting appropriately developed high quality assessment. What do you think this makes effective assessment tool high quality?
Good question. I think a high-quality assessment effective tools should be both reliable and valid. It needs to accurately measure the traits and we're targeting, like attitudes or values. But how do we really ensure that the effectiveness is valid? It's not we're testing factual knowledge.
It's more subjective. I'd say we need to look at how well the tool aligns with the specific of affective domain we're assessing. For example, if we're trying to measure students' motivation, shouldn't the tool be designed to capture both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation? What do you think?
That's a good point. But let's challenge you with this. How do we balance subjectivity of effective assessment with ensuring they're reliable across different learners? Is it enough to simply align the tool with the target domain should be considered?
I think reliability is effective. Assessment might come from consistency. Is how tools is used. For example, using tools across different situations or group of learners could yield similar results if the tool is reliable. But how do we ensure consistency when emotions and attitudes vary in so much between learners?
That's tricky. Maybe part of ensuring consistency is providing clear criteria for how we interpret results. Take self-reflection tools. For instance, students are realizing about their attitudes or self-concept. Shouldn't we be clear about what we're looking for? But if two students interpret the question differently, how do we deal with it?
Great brings back to the importance of tool development. High quality tools should come with rubrics or guidelines that stop rotation. But here's another question. Should effective tools be adaptable to learners or should they always stay set to maintain objectivity?
I think adaptability is the key, especially when dealing with effective traits. A tool should be able to reflect individual differences, like a student's unique values or motivation. But at the same time, we need to course structure to ensure fairness. How do we strike that balance?
Maybe the key is in selecting tools that are flexible and controlled but consistent in format. Like, we can adjust the prompts to be more relevant to the students' interest but keep the criteria for evaluation the same. What about when we're assessing creativity? Should the tools for that be more flexible compared to any assessing tools?
Good point. Assessing creativity might require more open-ended tools like project-based assessments or reflective portfolios because it's hard to standardize. For some values, maybe we need more weight benchmarks. Speaking of creativity, how would you develop a tool that encourages expression but still provides measurable outcomes?
I'd say the method has learners' developmental level and context. For instance, younger students understand to assessments like using pictures to express their feelings, while older students can be held under more abstract assessments, like reflective essays. But how do we ensure that the tools are still valid and reliable across different learners?
Alright, let's dive into the second learning objectives. Using target and learner appropriate effective assessment methods and tools. What do you guys think makes an assessment method learner appropriate when it comes to effective domains like motivation or self-concept?
I'd say that the method has to fit the learner's developmental level of context. For instance, younger students may respond to a better visual assessments like using pictures to express their feelings, while older students can handle some abstract assessments like reflective essays. But how do we ensure that the tools are still valid and reliable across different learner groups?
Good point. I think the key is not just in the tools themselves but how they are used. For example, we can use journals for self-concept assessment in both younger and older students. But the prompt should be adjusted. So, do you think it's more important to focus on the tools of the learner, how it aligns with target effective domain?
That's the first one. Ideally, it should be a balance, right? The tool must target the specific affective domain while being flexible enough to fit the learner. But let me ask you this: how do we decide which method is most appropriate for a specific affective target like motivation? What factors should we be considering?
I think we need to consider both the type of motivation we're assessing, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, the learner's preferences. For instance, some students might express their motivation better through open-ended tasks like project-based assessments, while others might prefer more structured formats like Likert scales. But how can we be sure that we are not introducing bias based on the method we choose?
That's a good question. I think bias can creep in if we really rely to one type of assessment. Maybe the answer lies in using a mix of methods. For example, combining self-report surveys with behavioral observation to give us further pictures. But I think there's a reason over assessing the domain how to balance the need for truthfulness with practicality.
It's a valid concern. We don't want to all students to make effective assessment feel like core. Sure, but here's a follow-up. If we use to multiple as effective domains like agriculture is comparable and consistent.
Maybe consistency comes from how we can interpret the results rather than methods themselves. For example, if we're assessing creativity between both and self-report and as performance tasks, the criteria for evaluating creativity should be the same across methods. But raises another questions. Should we always aim for consistency, or should effective assessment be flexible to account for individual differences?
I think flexibility is okay in effective assessment, especially because emotions, motivations, and values are so personal. But at the same time, we need a framework to ensure fairness. Speaking of flexibility, how do we design or select tools that can adapt to diverse learners without compromising their effectiveness?
Tools that are useful to learning styles. Some question of something as complex as learners don't
Using assessment results to inform instructions and market aspects like knowledge recycling, vocalizing data trends and patterns. Teachers can categorize results to identify specific areas needing attention. For instance, students should show high anxiety in certain subjects. Instructional strategies such as differential teaching or additional can be used. Student back discussion or support insights into their anxieties. Regularly revisiting and adjusting instructional approaches based on assessment data to create a positive learning environment that address students' emotional and educational needs.
about the third learning objective, interpreting performance assessment data to improve performance and form instruction. How do you think effective assessment data like motivation can actually help teacher adjust their teaching strategies?
That's how we interpret it. We notice students have limitations. For instance, it might indicate that we need to make the lessons more engaging and personalized. But that makes me wonder, how do we interpret data? How can we be sure we're drawing the right conclusion from effective assessment?
Right, I think using multiple sources of data helps reduce the risk of misinterpretation. For example, if students scoring low on motivation and self-report time, their class participation could signal for the action reflects data or intentional klaro.
That's a great question. I'd say for internal notes with observation and feedback from the students might help. But it makes me think once we interpret the data, how we decide for instructional strategy. Being best addressed like self-discipline or high effort. Do you rely with some intervention and tailor them to others?
That's a tricky
Ikaw
balance.
na, ikaw pa.
That's a tricky balance. Data can definitely guide us, but I think we still need to trust our professional instincts. For instance, if the data says a student has low creativity but in class they show a lot of out of the box thinking, that's something we need to consider. But it brings up another question. How do we handle data that seems inconsidered or doesn't align with what we observe?
Maybe that's where the idea of collaboration comes in. Using multiple data points to give a clearer picture. If the data from an effective survey doesn't match what's within the classroom, you might need to revisit that assessment mode example in person external factors influencing students' performance. But what if the data is accurate and continue to display motivation across different area? How can we prioritize what to address first?
Prioritizing would depend on which factors are effective learning the most. If a lack of motivation is leading to poor academic performance, that should be probably procedure. But here's a question for you. Once we interpret the data and decide on the interventions, how can we measure whether our adjustments are actually improving learners' outcomes?
That's a great question. We need to have follow-up assessment, both effective and cognitive, to see if there's progress. For example, after adjusting our teaching methods to both boost motivation, we can look at improvements in both student self-reported motivations and academic performance. But how do we think? How do we avoid the repeating symptoms like low motivation instead of addressing the root cause?
That's important. It's easy to focus on boosting motivation with incentives, but we need to dig deeper into why the students lacks motivation in the first place. Is it the subject matter, their learning environment, or maybe even eternal factors like family issues? Understanding the root cause requires more than looking at the numbers. It's about understanding the whole students. So final question. How do we ensure that the reviewing assessment gives a chance to react but create a long-term plan for improving both effective and academic performance?
To use data for long-term improvement to both effective and academic performance, it is essential to establish clear goals aligning with identified areas for growth. Teachers should analyze over rather than reacting to isolated data points. Developing a comprehensive action plan that includes interventions, regular monitoring, and reflective sessions allows for continuous adjustment based on effectiveness. Collaborating with colleagues to create strategies and insights can enhance the approach. Additionally, involving students in the goal-setting process fosters ownership and engagement, ensuring that improvements are meaningful and sustained throughout the learning journey.